before Bumpy Johnson ran Harlem, before Stephanie St. Clair became the queen of policy, before Dutch Schultz tried to steal the numbers racket, before any of them, there was a man whose name echoed through every block north of 110th Street. His name was Luther Boddy, and in January 1922, he did something that nobody in the history of New York City had ever done before. He killed 2 white detectives in Harlem. Then he vanished, disguised himself as a woman, commandeered a taxi at gunpoint, fled across 3 states, and triggered the biggest manhunt New York City had ever seen. 40,000 police officers, building by building, block by block, across 3 states. For one black man. This was 1922 2 years before Bumpy Johnson even worked his first corner. 3 years before Casper Holstein built the numbers empire. A decade before Dutch Schultz tried to take over. Luther Boddy was first, and his story, the story of what the police did to him, what he did back, and what happened after, is one of the most important stories in the history of Harlem. And almost nobody knows it happened. To understand Luther Boddy, you have to understand what Harlem looked like for a black man in 1922. The Great Migration was in full swing. Hundreds of thousands of black families were pouring into New York from the South, from Georgia, from the Carolinas, from Alabama, from Mississippi, looking for something better than sharecropping and lynch mobs. Harlem was where they landed, and for a moment, it looked like the promise was real. The streets were alive, jazz clubs on every corner, rent parties in every building, barber shops buzzing with conversation, churches overflowing on Sunday mornings. The Harlem Renaissance was about to explode. But underneath the music and the culture and the hope, there was something else. The 38th Precinct. The 38th Precinct was the New York Police Department station on West 135th Street. It was the heart of law enforcement in Harlem. And for black men who lived in that neighborhood, it was a torture chamber, not figuratively, literally. The officers at the 38th Precinct practiced what they called the third degree. That meant beatings. Systematic, organized, repeated beatings of black men during questioning, not during arrests for violent crimes, but during questioning about anything. About a burglary 3 blocks away that you might have seen. About a fight outside a speakeasy that you walked past. About a shooting that you had nothing to do with. You did not have to be guilty of anything. You did not have to be charged with anything. If you were a black man known to the police in Harlem, if you had a record, if you had been seen on the wrong corner at the wrong time, if somebody whispered your name during an investigation, the detectives at the 38th Precinct would come find you, drag you to the station, and beat you until they were satisfied. With fists, with clubs, with whatever was handy. And then they would let you go, bruised, bleeding, sometimes unable to walk. And they would do it again the next time they needed a suspect, and the time after that. Luther Boddy knew this firsthand, because it happened to him again, and again, and again. Boddy was not a choir boy. Nobody is claiming that. He had been arrested multiple times for burglary, larceny, and petty crimes. He had a record. He was known to police as a frequent criminal who operated in what the newspapers of 1922 called the Black and Tan District, their term for the part of Harlem where black people lived. But here's the detail that changes this entire story. Despite all those arrests, despite being a usual suspect that the police grabbed every time something happened in Harlem, Boddy was convicted of very few of those crimes. Very few. Because in most cases, there was no evidence connecting him to anything. The police arrested him because he was convenient, because he was black, because he had a file, and because when your captain wants to see progress on a case, you grab the nearest black man with a record and you bring him in. And when you bring him in, you do not ask questions politely. you use the third degree. Boddy testified under oath at his trial about what the detectives at the 38th Precinct did to him. He described being beaten so badly that he was bedridden for a week afterward. Not sore, not bruised, bedridden, unable to stand up, unable to feed himself for 7 days because of what the police did to him during routine questioning about crimes he was not charged with and was not convicted of. This did not happen once. It happened repeatedly, over years. A cycle of arrests, beatings, releases, and more arrests. The same faces, the same fists, the same station. And 2 detectives were worse than all the others. Sergeant Francis J. M. Buckley, Detective William H. Miller. These 2 men, according to Boddy's sworn testimony, were the most aggressive, the most violent, the most consistent in their abuse. They did not just participate in the beatings, they led them. They seemed to enjoy them. Remember those names, because Luther Boddy remembered them every single day. In late 1921, a black police officer named Jasper Rhodes was shot while on duty in Harlem. He was hit twice, once in the abdomen and once in the shoulder. He survived. But the NYPD wanted a suspect. And like they always did when a crime happened in Harlem, they went to the usual list of names, the file cabinet of black men who could be brought in for questioning. Luther Boddy was on that list. Detectives Buckley and Miller were assigned to bring him in. Now stop and think about what that meant for Luther Boddy. The same 2 men who had beaten him unconscious multiple times. The same 2 men who had left him unable to walk for a week. The same 2 men who had used the third degree on him again and again and again. These specific officers, not just any cops, these 2 were now coming to his door to question him about a shooting he said he had nothing to do with. Boddy knew what questioning meant at the 38th Precinct. He had the scars to prove it. He had the weeks of bed rest to prove it. He knew exactly what was going to happen when those 2 men got their hands on him again. Maybe this would be the time they went too far. Maybe this would be the beating he did not walk away from. Maybe this would be the one where they forgot to stop. January 6, 1922, Buckley and Miller found Luther Boddy in Harlem. What happened next depends entirely on who you believe. The police version is simple. 2 detectives approached a suspect for routine questioning. The suspect produced a weapon and opened fire without provocation. Cold-blooded murder of 2 officers of the law. Luther Boddy's version is different. He said these men had tortured him for years, that they had beaten him beyond what any human being should endure, that they had violated his rights so many times that the law was meaningless because the law was the thing hurting him. And he said that when they came for him again, when the same 2 men who had brutalized him showed up to take him back to that station, he knew what was coming. Luther Boddy pulled a gun. He shot Sergeant Francis J. M. Buckley, dead. He shot Detective William H. Miller, dead. 2 white NYPD detectives killed by a black man in Harlem in 1922. New York City had never seen anything like it, and what happened next was even bigger. The NYPD's response was the largest police mobilization in the history of New York City up to that point. 40,000 officers were mobilized. Every precinct in every borough was activated, and every available man was deployed. Detectives, patrolmen, plainclothes officers, mounted police. Every badge in the city was looking for Luther Boddy. They did not just search Harlem. They tore it apart, building by building, block by block, apartment by apartment, door by door. Officers kicked in doors without warrants. They pulled black men out of their beds in the middle of the night. They stopped every black man on the street and demanded identification. They searched businesses without permission, and they searched churches. They emptied barbershops and lined men up against walls, and they were not gentle about it. Newspaper reports from January 1922 described police officers who were not always gentle with Negroes that answered slyly or stupidly. That is the polite language of the time. The plain truth is the NYPD beat their way through Harlem looking for Luther Boddy. Any black man who did not answer fast enough, politely enough, or submissively enough got a taste of the same third degree that had been applied to Boddy himself. The manhunt for one man became a punishment for an entire neighborhood. The black community was in uproar, not because they supported what Boddy did, but because the police were using his actions as an excuse to brutalize everyone who looked like him. The very behavior that had driven Boddy to kill two detectives was now being inflicted on thousands of innocent people in the search for him. The manhunt expanded beyond New York into New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Connecticut across 3 states. Headlines ran in newspapers across the country for one man. But Luther Boddy was already gone. While the entire NYPD was tearing Harlem apart, Boddy was executing one of the most audacious escapes in New York crime history. First he took a bus, then a crosstown streetcar, then the subway. Each transfer was calculated to put distance between himself and the largest police operation the city had ever mounted. He moved through the city like a ghost, calm enough to board public transportation, smart enough to keep switching vehicles, disciplined enough not to run. He made it to New Jersey, to a woman friend's house, and there, knowing that every police officer in 3 states had his description and that his face was about to be in every newspaper in America, he did something that showed just how sharp his survival instincts were. He asked the woman for her clothes. She gave them to him, a dress, a hat, maybe a shawl. The details varied depending on the source, but the result was the same. Luther Boddy walked out of that house looking nothing like the man the police were hunting. Think about the discipline that required. He had just killed 2 men. The adrenaline must have been screaming in his veins. Every instinct in his body must have been telling him to run, to sprint as far and as fast as possible. But instead he slowed down. He thought. He calculated. And he put on a dress. A black man wanted for killing 2 white detectives, disguised in women's clothing, walking through New Jersey while the manhunt raged. They were looking for Luther Boddy, not a woman walking calmly through the streets. But he wasn't done moving. New Jersey was too close. He needed to get further south. So he found a taxi and he pulled a gun on the driver. He commandeered the cab and forced the driver to take him toward Pennsylvania, mile after mile, through the dark, through the countryside. A man in a dress holding a gun on a terrified taxi driver, heading south, while the biggest manhunt in New York history raged behind him. The cab drove until it ran out of gas on a rural road somewhere between New Jersey and Pennsylvania. The engine sputtered and the car rolled to a stop. The driver, who had been sitting in terror for hours, saw his chance. He bolted, ran into the darkness, and escaped. Boddy was stranded on a dark road, in women's clothes, with a gun, and nothing else. But he had friends in Philadelphia, and somehow, through a combination of walking, hitching rides, and sheer determination, he made it there. He found his people. He hid out. He caught his breath for the first time since January 6th. For a few days, Luther Boddy, the most wanted man in America, was living in Philadelphia while 40,000 police officers searched Harlem, searched New Jersey, searched everywhere except where he actually was. But friends have limits. The pressure, the reward money, the fear of being caught harboring a cop killer, and the knowledge that the entire NYPD would come down on anyone connected to Boddy broke someone's loyalty. One of Boddy's friends betrayed him to the Philadelphia police. Luther Boddy was arrested, brought back to New York in chains, and put on trial for double murder. The trial was a sensation. Every newspaper in New York covered it. The city wanted blood. 2 dead officers, a black suspect, 1922. The outcome seemed predetermined, but the defense told a story that nobody expected. Former Judge Morris Koenig volunteered as Boddy's defense counsel. Koenig was not a radical, not an activist, not a crusader. He was a retired judge, a member of the establishment who looked at the facts of this case and saw something that disgusted him. Koenig stood in that courtroom and laid out, in detail, on the record, for the newspapers and the public, everything that the officers of the 38th Precinct had done to Luther Boddy. The years of beatings, the third degree, the weeks in bed, the systematic, repeated brutality inflicted on a man who was rarely convicted of the crimes he was arrested for, the specific violence committed by the specific officers he killed. Koenig told the court that he could not understand why some men, immediately on donning a police uniform, become instruments of horror and cruel methods. That statement ran in newspapers across the city. A former judge, not a defendant, not an activist, a judge, was standing in a courtroom and calling the NYPD instruments of horror. Koenig argued that Boddy's actions, while criminal, were the direct result of years of police torture. That a man who has been beaten unconscious by the same officers who are now coming for him again has a reasonable expectation of what is about to happen. That the system had failed Luther Boddy so completely and so violently that his response, while illegal, was the response of a man who had been pushed past every limit a human being can endure. The argument did not save Boddy from conviction. A jury in 1922 was never going to acquit a black man for killing 2 white police officers, regardless of what those officers had done to him. But the trial did something more important than acquitting one man. It put the 38th Precinct on trial. For the first time, the systematic abuse of black men by the NYPD was entered into the public record, documented, testified to, published. Police Commissioner Richard Enright responded exactly the way police commissioners have responded for the last 100 years. He denied everything. Enright told reporters that there is no brutality or third-degree methods in the police department. He said this with a straight face, even as the testimony of a former judge describing years of beatings was still fresh in the court record. Then Enright went further. He demanded that newspapers stop printing stories about police violence. He said, publishing such stories gave men like Boddy excuses for their actions. Men like Boddy. That phrase, dismissive, dehumanizing, deliberately vague, has been used by police officials to dismiss complaints about brutality for over 100 years now. Men like Boddy, men like Rodney King, men like Eric Garner, men like George Floyd. The same precinct behavior, the same institutional denial, the same language, 100 years apart. But Luther Boddy's case didn't just expose police brutality, it triggered something that had never happened before in Harlem. The black community organized. In the weeks after the trial, Harlem residents, not criminals, not gangsters, but ordinary working people, began demanding change. They demanded that the 38th Precinct be shut down. They demanded that black officers be assigned to patrol black neighborhoods. They demanded an end to the third degree. The New York Herald ran a headline in January 1922, "Harlem Demands Old Police Station." The community wanted the 38th Precinct, the building where Luther Boddy and countless other black men had been beaten, removed from their neighborhood entirely. Community leaders argued that the Boddy case wasn't an isolated incident. It was the inevitable result of a system that treated black men like animals. When you beat a man for years and then come back to beat him again, you shouldn't be surprised when he fights back. The surprise would be if he didn't. The demands went mostly unanswered. Commissioner Enright continued to deny that brutality existed. The 38th Precinct stayed open. The Third Degree continued. But something had shifted in Harlem's consciousness. The community had seen, through Boddy's trial, through Koenig's testimony, through the newspaper coverage, that police violence against black men was not random. It was policy. It was systematic. It was the way the system was designed to work. And that awareness, that collective understanding that the police were not there to protect Black Harlem, but to control it, shaped everything that came after. It shaped Stephanie St. Clair's willingness to name corrupt cops in newspapers. It shaped Bumpy Johnson's understanding that the law and justice were two completely different things. It shaped the entire culture of the 1920s and the 1930s in Harlem, a community that knew from bitter experience that the only protection available was the protection you built yourself. Luther Boddy didn't start that awareness, but his case, his trial, his lawyer, standing in a courtroom, calling police officers instruments of horror, brought it into the light for the first time, on the record, in the newspapers. Luther Boddy was convicted and sentenced. His story disappeared from the headlines within weeks. The manhunt was over. The trial was done. Harlem moved on. But here's what didn't disappear. The memory of Luther Boddy, on the streets, in the barber shops, among the hustlers and the runners, and the young men who were watching everything and learning. In 1919, 3 years before the Boddy manhunt, a 14-year-old boy from Charleston, South Carolina, arrived in Harlem. His parents had sent him north because they were terrified. The boy had a short temper, an explosive anger, and a dangerous habit of showing insolence toward white people, which in Charleston in 1919 could get a black teenager lynched. His name was Ellsworth Raymond Johnson. A bump on the back of his head gave him his nickname, Bumpy. When Luther Boddy killed those two detectives in January 1922, Bumpy Johnson was 16 years old, living in Harlem, walking the same streets, hearing the same conversations, watching the same manhunt unfold. 40,000 police officers. Every block searched. Every black man stopped. And at the center of it, one man who had been beaten so many times by the police that he decided the only option left was to fight back. Nobody can prove that Luther Boddy directly shaped Bumpy Johnson. There is no interview where Bumpy says he saw what Boddy did and it changed him. But think about the environment. A teenager with a violent temper and a hatred of authority. Living in a neighborhood where the biggest story of 1922 is a black man who killed 2 abusive detectives, escaped dressed as a woman, led 40,000 cops on a chase across 3 states, and became the most famous criminal in New York overnight. That's the soil Bumpy Johnson grew in, Luther Boddy's Harlem, a place where the police beat black men for sport, and one man one time decided he'd had enough. Within a decade, Bumpy would be working for Stephanie St. Clair. Within 2 decades, he would be the most powerful black gangster in New York City. Within 3 decades, he would be sitting across the table from the Italian mafia, negotiating as an equal, the only black man in America who could do that. But before any of it, before the numbers racket, before the wars with Dutch Schultz, before the deals with Lucky Luciano, before the legend, there was Luther Boddy, the man nobody remembers, the man who proved in 1922 that one black man could make the entire system tremble 40,000 cops, 3 states, a borrowed dress, and a question that still hasn't been answered 100 years later. What happens when you beat a man so many times that he stops being afraid of the consequences? Luther Boddy answered that question on January 6, 1922, and the NYPD has been trying to pretend he didn't ever since.